Right.
Sorry, so let me just introduce you quickly. So we have the real pleasure to have Anna McCoy here to speak with us today. Anna says that her research focuses on developing first principles methods for predicting properties of nuclear structure and reactions. She then uses these predictions to gain insight into the underlying symmetries and correlations that give rise to emergent collective behavior. She began her career in physics at the Perner Institute for Theoretical Physics, where she did a master's in quantum gravity. Very cool. Then went on to earn a PhD in nuclear theory from the University of Notre Dame. Before joining the staff at Argonne National Lab, Anna was a postdoctoral fellow at Triumph and the Institute for Nuclear Theory in Seattle, Washington, and was an Efford Theory Fellow at Washington University. Anna, would you like us to hold off on questions or ask questions as we go along?
I'd say go ahead and ask questions as we go along.
Amazing. So we're going to hear about predicting properties of nuclei from first principles, and we're very excited to hear from you. Please take it away when you're ready.
There we go. Okay, so just kind of a rough outline of what I'll be talking about. I'll kind of introduce some of the nuclear properties of interest that we're trying to calculate or predict. Talk a little bit about nuclear forces, how we solve the nuclear Hamiltonian eigenproblem to get those predictions that we want, and then just briefly start to talk a little bit about the emergence of nuclear collective behavior, which is sort of the foundation of what my research is about. So some of the nuclear properties that we're interested in are things like the binding energy or excitation energies of a nucleus. And we want to be able to predict properties like the mass of the nucleus, how large the radius of the nucleus is, what the different spin properties are, and sort of how what the decay modes of a particular nucleus are, how long it lives, how it decays, and then like different reaction cross sections. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment about what some of these different things are. But one of the first thing that we're always have to try to predict is the binding energy. So nuclear binding energy is the difference in mass energy between a nucleus and the protons and neutrons that make up that nucleus. And the idea is it's basically the amount of energy that you would need to add into the system in order to then break apart the nucleus into the protons and neutrons that make it up. So normally we think of binding energy as being negative, but for some reason, nuclear physicists decide to sometimes present this in terms of a positive number, and they often will then quote it as the binding energy per number of nucleons, A. And that's what's plotted here. It's the binding energy as a positive number versus the mass number. And so for the lighter systems, this is where it's actually more energetically favorable when you bring different nuclei together to then fuse together and fission together and create heavier systems. At larger mass numbers, they tend to want to break apart because that actually ends up being more energetically favorable. And you end up with two systems with the binding energies that are larger. And then there's this very stable region around iron 56, which is where things don't really change or shift or move. But what's curious in this lighter region is as you increase the number of particles and go up, at some point there's a drop that's very large in the binding energies per nucleon. And this was a phenomena that took a really long time to understand. And it was actually, it was 1964, I believe, was the year when someone won the Nobel Prize for finally explaining that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the development of that model because this became the foundation of a lot of our intuition and understanding of the nuclear physics that go into these sort of first principles models that I work with. So to calculate the nuclear binding energy, what we're trying to do is basically just solve the Hamiltonian eigenproblem, which is exactly what you do if you've taken any sort of quantum mechanics class. So in principle, it's very simple. The catch is that while we know that there are four fundamental forces, there's gravity, which obeys an inverse square law. Electromagnetism also obeys an inverse square law. There's the strong nuclear force, which, well, we know it's what holds the protons and neutrons together. And then there's the weak force that it's there. Unfortunately for us, the forces that are most important for describing the nucleus are the ones that we know the least about. we don't have any kind of closed form to describe these systems. And so we can only kind of get at it by probing the force indirectly to try to understand what's going on. So if we want to be able to calculate the nuclear binding energy, the first thing we have to do is figure out what the nuclear potential actually is. So we do know that the nuclear potential has what we call a hard core, where the potential goes to infinity at the distances of where the protons and neutrons would try to overlap. Because in the energy regions that we care about at low energy, where nuclear physics happens, there's not enough energy to break apart the protons and neutrons into the quarks and gluons that make up those particles. And so we know the nuclear potential can't force the particles to overlap. So we have this infinite sort of potential there. But then we know that the strong force is holding the nucleus together, so the potential becomes negative for a while until you get out to some distance where the strong force starts to become weaker and weaker, and the electromagnetism takes over. And at some point it becomes positive, and this is the region where the electromagnetism is trying to force the protons, which are electrically charged, apart. And so we have some sort of idea of what this form potential should look like, and you can think about trying to do a series expansion of your potential to sort of, and then fit that potential to what we know from experiment. And it turns out that there's a few different terms. You have a constant term. The second term actually cancels because of parity constraints. And what you're left with is something that looks like a constant plus something that goes as x squared. Well, that looks a lot like the harmonic oscillator. And as physicists, we love the harmonic oscillator because it's one of the few problems we actually know how to solve. So as a first attempt, can sort of approximate the nuclear potential as a harmonic oscillator. And a little bit of foreshadowing, you can see that for some regions of the nuclear range of the nuclear force, that might be reasonable, but there's other regions where it's not. But it's a first attempt. So we all kind of know how to solve the harmonic oscillator eigenproblem to get out the sort of harmonic oscillator states. And they are typically characterized by three numbers. There's the radial known number, which corresponds to the number of oscillations of your function, and then the orbital angular momentum and its projection. And the energies of these different harmonic oscillator states is proportional or almost proportional to n plus a half, where n is twice the radial node number plus the orbital angular momentum, and it's the number of oscillator quanta associated with that particular state. But what I want to point out is that there's a certain degeneracy for these energies. So I could, if I was trying to construct a state that had n equals 2, so 2 quanta, I could either take a function that had 0 radial quanta and 2 orbital angular momentum, or 1 radial node and 0 orbital angular momentum. Both of those would give me n equals 2. So there's one state that would have n equals 0 and n equals 1 and L equals 0. And there's 5 states that would have n equals 0 and L equals 2. And so there's a degeneracy of states. There'd be 6 states in total, which would all have the same energy because they have the same n. And this plays a role in how we construct the many-body system. So in the nuclear shell model, what we do is we take our different protons and neutrons and we start putting them in these different harmonic oscillator states. And so you put as many particles as you can in the n equals 0 shell, then you start adding particles into the n equals 1 shell, subject to the Pauli exclusion principle, which says you can't have more than one particle in the same state. So I should point out that in addition to the quantum numbers coming from the harmonic oscillator, which was that n and L, the protons and neutrons also have an intrinsic spin to them. And so you can combine the orbital angular momentum and the spin to get what's called total angular momentum. And so there's an additional 2 particles per harmonic oscillator state that you can then put into your each level. And that's what's actually shown here, is that additional degeneracy that you get. And these numbers in this column are actually showing the number of particles you can put in each of these different levels. And then this is just the total number of particles as you would fill up. So in the nuclear shell model, you can put, for example, 2 protons and 2 neutrons in the n equals 0 shell. And then we say that that shell is closed or full because you can't put any additional particles in here. In the shell model, the idea is you then treat those particles as an inert core. So you have this sort of core of particles, and any particles then you put then outside of that into the next level are the ones that are actually being allowed to interact and move around. And the ones in the core are more tightly bound. And so what they do is they generate a mean field that then the particles outside of that core, the valence particles, are impacted by. And so the dynamics of your system are then governed by this mean field generated by the core. And if you take this sort of picture and you do this sort of naive filling as you go up in number of particles, and when you get to the closures, which are indicated by the numbers in the circles, and you look at the binding energy per nucleon. So when you get to helium-4, you've filled up the shell with 2 protons and 2 neutrons, so 4 particles in total. And then when you add in the next particle, you're going outside of this very tightly bound core. So that next particle that you add in goes into the next level, but it's more weakly bound because it's easier to pop out because it's not part of this tightly bound core. And so the average binding energy or the binding energy per nucleon will suddenly drop. And that's what happens here as you go from helium-4 to lithium-6. And if you track all of these wiggles in this diagram, it actually corresponded exactly to the different levels that you had, where you would find those different places where you'd have all of the particles tightly bound in a core, and then it drops when you try to add the next particle in. And so this very simple model, which was developed simultaneously by Maria Geppert-Meyer at Argonne National Lab, which is where I am, and Hans Jensen in Germany, they were awarded the Nobel Prize for this discovery. And so this was a fantastic model and it's been used to describe new properties of nuclei for decades and is still highly used even to this day. But there's a couple of problems with using this model. So while it does a good job of describing the binding energies, it doesn't do as good of a job of describing some of these other properties. And so you can take this model, you can fit it to data, and you can kind of get out an idea of what your potential looks like and predict the binding energies. But then if you want to try to get some of these other properties correct, basically you add in a fudge factor and you kind of tune that to the available data.
Sorry,
But
sorry, could you go back to the previous slide just on the binding energy per nucleon chart?
Mhm.
So the fact that the dips get smaller and smaller as you go up in nucleon size, is that just an artifact that we're taking an average, and this extra particle that's more free has less of a weight on that average as the total number of particles goes up? Is that a
that's a large part of it. The other caveat is that the levels, this is not the best representation. The levels aren't the same spacing between them. So some of the spacings are a bit different as well, and that also contributes to why it gets more and more shallow.
Okay.
Yeah, so if we want to be able to predict all of these properties without having to add in this fudge factor, we need to do something a little bit different. The other reason that we want to, aside from just it's more satisfying not to have to add in fudge factors, is that the shell model and models like that can easily be applied where nuclei are very stable. So this is what we call the chart of the nucleides. You've plotted this is number of protons, this is number of neutrons. Each box represents a different nucleus that we can form that we know exists. And around where approximately n equals z, this is where you get the most stable nuclei. And if you have a nucleus that's outside of this sort of region, it will eventually try to decay and move back towards nuclei that are very stable. But what for a lot of the things that we care about for fusion and fission energy sources, astrophysical processes, understanding sort of physics beyond the standard model even, what we actually care about and are most interested in are nuclei that are sort of what we call the extremes of the nuclear landscape, where you have a large number of protons or neutrons relative to the other number. So out here, you have an excess of protons, and down here, you have a lot more neutrons than protons. And what happens is when you have that type of a system, it becomes highly unstable and it's much more weakly bound. And so it won't live very long before it's going to decay or break apart. And so there's very little experimental data, and it's only the most cutting edge experiments that have even started to be able to describe some of these or measure properties of the nuclei out in these regions. And so we have this problem where we want our models to be able to predict nuclei for which there's very little data. And this was basically what sort of pushed forward a bunch of theories which are referred to as first principles theories or ab initio methods. So the idea behind ab initio nuclear theory or first principles nuclear theory is we want to derive the nuclear potential between the protons and the neutrons, actually starting from the quantum chromodynamics, which is what governs how quarks and gluons interact with each other. So at high energies, you can actually say something about quantum chromodynamics where you've got enough energy in your system to break apart the protons and neutrons in terms of the quarks and gluons that make them up. However, in the region that we care about at lower energies, suddenly this theory of quantum chromodynamics is no longer a perturbative theory, and so it's much harder we can't just directly describe nucleons and their interactions in terms of quantum chromodynamics. And so people have come up with something called chiral effective field theory to try to extract from what we know about the interaction between quarks and gluons to obtain an interaction between the protons and neutrons. So it's just a reminder, we are looking for these sort of two forces, but I'll actually focus entirely on the strong force because that's the one that's actually holding the nucleus together. So unfortunately, we still don't have our inverse square law, even when we look at things in terms of quantum chromodynamics. But what we can do is do this, it's effectively just another series expansion, where we're doing a series expansion of this sort of field theory that describes the strong force at higher energies. You take that theory and you try to essentially zoom out in size, and you integrate out the quarks and gluons in your picture, and you end up with some sort of residual looking terms. Is there a question?
Oh.
Okay. And so you have sort of this effective theory of the interactions between the protons and the neutrons. And these different Feynman diagrams are sort of a pictorial representation of the different terms, where each one of these little points corresponds to an interaction, a proton and neutron, where we've zoomed out, and it's actually if you zoomed back in, you'd be able to resolve the different quarks and gluon pictures. And it's a series expansion in the sense that there are certain terms that we expect to be the most important. And these sort of terms are the ones that will actually still look quite a bit like sort of that harmonic oscillator Hamiltonian we started with. And then you have these different terms as you sort of perturb the system, they start to resolve the dynamics that you see at sort of the longer range behaviors. And so this is then what we feed into our models. So we're back to trying to calculate the nuclear binding energy and solve the Hamiltonian eigenproblem. And the way I do it, and most of us do, is that we expand our wave functions in yet another series expansion. And when you do that, that turns your Hamiltonian equation into a matrix eigenproblem, which in theory we know how to solve because you just diagonalize your Hamiltonian matrix, and that gives you your energies and energy eigenstates, where the eigenstates are your wave functions that you care about. And the basis that I use, it's very similar to what was used in the shell model, where again, you're distributing your particles over these different harmonic oscillator states, starting from the lowest shell and filling up each of the different levels as much as you can. However, unlike in the shell model, the particles are not frozen when you fill up a particular level. There's no more core, which is why the method's called the no core shell model. What that means is I can take any particle anywhere in this system and I can excite it. So I can take a particle that lives in the n=0 shell and I can move it up and put it in the n=1 shell. And by doing that, I've added one additional quanta of energy to my system. And I could take another particle and I could move it up another shell. Now I've added another quanta to my system. So I have two total quanta relative to what that sort of lowest energy configuration was. And so we called that type of configuration n excitation equals 2 configuration of particles. Or as another example, I could take one particle and I could move it up 2 shells. Again, I'm just adding 2 additional quanta. And so that again is a configuration with 2 extra excitation quanta, or an nx=2 configuration. But I don't have to stop at 2. In fact, in this basis, you continue exciting particles and even all of the particles up to the highest possible harmonic oscillator eigenstate, which is actually at infinity. So in theory, this basis is infinite dimensional. But I don't know about you, but I can't diagonalize an infinite dimensional matrix. So we sort of truncate our basis, or we assume that those basis states that are most important for describing our actual wave function are the ones that are most similar to sort of that shell model picture with the fewest number of oscillator quanta. And that as you continue with your series expansion, the ones that contribute the least are the ones that have the sort of highest number of excitation quanta, because they're not as important for resolving the broad properties of the nucleus. And so we truncate the basis and therefore bring the Hamiltonian eigenmatrix down to a finite size by saying I'm only going to include basis states if the number of excitation quanta associated with that state is less than some parameter, and we call that n max. So because I'm truncating it, I won't be able to actually get exact values for my energies or other properties that I'm trying to calculate, but I can get a reasonable approximation if I go to a large enough basis size or a large enough value of n max. So then the question is, how large does that n max value have to be? How many terms in that series do I have to include to get an accurate enough prediction? And so what we are looking for to see if our results are actually accurate enough is we want the results to be approximately independent of the basis. That means that it doesn't matter if we add more terms into the series, the result's not going to change that much. And the way we see that is we can take for example, our binding energy that we calculated, this is for helium-3, and I can plot for different values of n max the energies that I get. And there's an additional parameter associated with the basis. We always describe it in terms of a quantity called h bar omega. This is related to the oscillator length parameter, or how wide your harmonic oscillator potential is. But it's a characteristic of the basis. And so we can look at different possible values that you could take for h bar omega. And if my results are independent of the basis, it won't matter what value I actually picked. So for each of these different curves, I'm increasing the size of the basis, going from n max equals 4, 6, 8, up to n max equals 20. And you can see that the curves are getting closer and closer together as I continue to go up in n max, which means the results are depending less and less and less on those additional terms in my series expansion. And they're also getting flatter and flatter, which means that their dependence on which particular value of h bar omega that I chose, or how wide my oscillator potential is decreasing or going away. And so what I'd ideally like to see is a nice flat curve where if I increase from 20 to 22, that the two lines would fall on top of each other. And that signals what we call convergence. of the series. And that's where my results no longer require additional terms in the series expansion. You can do the same thing with any observable that we're trying to calculate. This is the proton radius of the nucleus. So it's how large the nucleus is essentially. And you can see that as I increase the number of Nmax, I'm starting to get flatter and flatter curves as I go, and they're getting closer and closer together, and they're starting to move towards convergence. But if I take another nucleus as an example, this is lithium-6, so slightly heavier, but still only 6 particles. And I do the same sort of thing. I can go up to Nmax equals 14. The curves are starting to get closer together and flattening out, but no, it doesn't look like what we had in the previous picture where it was nice and flat and they were on top of each other. So I would say that this is approaching convergence in my series expansion, but it's not quite there. However, if you then look at the proton radius for lithium-6, at some values of h bar omega, the lines are getting close together, but in general, there's a heavy dependence on h bar omega, and the lines are still changing pretty rapidly as I increase the size of my basis or number of terms in the expansion. So this property is nowhere near converged. So I would need to go up to higher Nmax. Now here's the catch. The basis size grows very rapidly. So at Nmax 14 for lithium-6, I'm already at a basis size of about somewhere between 10 to the 8 and 10 to the 9. So I have a 10 to the 8 by 10 to the 8 matrix that I'm trying to diagonalize that I can still fit on supercomputers. But if I want to go much higher in Nmax, I'm very going to quickly run out of just memory on the supercomputers. And the largest matrix that we can currently diagonalize is somewhere between 10 to the 10 and 10 to the 11. So somewhere between 10 billion and 100 billion by 10 billion. So there are some limitations to this theory, in particular, this particular method that I was describing, which is the no-core shell model. And part of this is due to the fact that we are still starting from that sort of simple picture of approximating things starting from the harmonic oscillator potential, and then trying to add in additional terms in our expansion, both in our interaction and in our wave functions, to try to resolve what's going on at larger distances, or what we call the tail of the wave function. But there's other things that are also coming into play here, things like clustering, which is where you have some subset of the protons and the neutrons in the nucleus that tend to stick closer together or become more tightly bound than the rest of the particles in the nucleus. And that also impacts and can change what's going on. And I've mentioned the word collectivity, but collectivity also impacts how well this particular method can describe the nucleus. So what I was talking about was called the no-core shell model. It was one of the very first ab initio methods that was developed. And arguably, if you could go out to as large of a basis size as you needed, it would be the most exact method and give you the most precise answers. But there's been, in the past 20 to 30 years, a whole slew of different ab initio methods that have been developed that are trying to sort of overcome the fact that we can't fit that large of a matrix Hamiltonian on supercomputers. And the idea is that you take properties that we know to be approximately true, so symmetries or other selection criteria, to reduce the size of the basis. And that's what all of these different methods are. They're more clever techniques, which make some simplifying assumptions, but still give you fairly accurate results. And there's a whole bunch of other methods that are currently under development for describing nuclei. So instead of just being stuck at describing particles that have maybe 6 or 12 particles, with these different types of more clever methods, we've actually been able to describe a lot of different nuclei from first principles. And so the colored squares in this chart of the nuclei are all of the different nuclei that we've been able to calculate starting from that interaction that we derived from quantum chromodynamics. and then solve the Hamiltonian eigenproblem to get out energies and then use that to get other properties of the nucleus. So we've gone all the way from basically hydrogen and helium all the way up to there's actually been some recent calculations for lead 208. So a nucleus with 208 particles. And for all of these, we've been able to then actually calculate, for example, the binding energy. And what this picture is showing, it's a subset of that sort of larger chart of the nucleides. And it's describing where at some point, as you try to add in an additional proton or an additional neutron, the system becomes so loosely bound that adding one more particle in makes the whole thing fall apart. And the extra protons or extra neutrons then fall off, or we could say they drip off. And so we refer to that those nuclei as the drip line. It's the last nucleus that you can actually form before things become too unstable. And they're indicated in this picture by the little drip marks. And these are all calculated values where we calculate the binding energy and we figure out where the binding is so weak that adding another particle makes things fall apart. And it has been reasonably consistent with what we do know experimentally, but we've done a very good job of describing sort of these nuclei out in this region where it's so unstable that experiments have a lot of trouble actually being able to measure any of the properties out here. So we've been, with these different methods, we are able to predict a lot of these different nuclear properties, perhaps not perfectly yet, but we can do it without having to add in these little fudge factors to sort of tune the values to experiment. We make no real reference to any experiment other than for the very lightest systems where we check or we kind of fit the interactions to describe sort of helium and hydrogen type of nuclei. Okay, so I'm gonna change gears here in just a minute and start talking about collectivity. So I might just pause and see if there's any questions at this point.
I'm
Oops.
curious about having these parameters that just get to sit around in your model, like you have the n max for the previous model and the sort of the size of your oscillator. I assume there's been attempts to do the sort of like the lattice QCD thing where you sort of take your system at different sizes and then eventually fit a line to the point where the cell size goes to 0. Is that something that happens in this as well, or is that sort of not viable?
So in some cases, you are able to do that type of thing where you fit a line and we say you extrapolate the properties. It's sometimes you can do that. There's certain properties, particularly like the radii or other observables, where here you see it sort of looks like it's very smoothly changing, but you'll actually see things like the radius will go up and then it'll come back down and then it'll go up and then it'll go, and kind of oscillates and change around the actual true value. And those are much harder to extrapolate. So typically what we do is when we have sort of this continued model dependence is we attempt to extrapolate or give sort of the best value that we have, but then we assign an uncertainty based on how well converged or not well converged the value is. And that's what we then share with experimentalists. Because in addition to sort of these sort of basis parameters that are still floating around, there is the fact that we technically still don't know the nuclear potential, and we're just sort of trying to approximate or guess what it actually looks like. So there's multiple levels of uncertainty that we have to sort of be careful to say that they exist.
Thank you.
Any other
So-
questions?
Jump in for another question. So when you're dealing with the convergence as you increase n max, I think it's the slide before or a couple slides before. Sorry, yeah, so like, when you're saying you want, obviously you want the lines to all converge to one and then be nice and on top of each other, but also you want it to be flat along the HW, so that there's no dependence on HW. Kind of, so what criteria are you looking for then? Because it's not just all converge to the same curve, but it's also converged to a fairly flat curve, as I'm understanding it.
Yeah, that's correct. So we want both things to happen, like they're starting to do here. And this value, we would sort of say that this value is more or less converged for a particular range of h bar omega values. And this relates to an energy, so I could say that my theory for particular energies of the system are converged pretty well at this point. And this is what I'd say is sort of the true value coming out of the model. But then we'd have to assign an sort of uncertainty or error estimate of, or just say outside of this sort of energy range, this is not necessarily the correct or best value, or there's a lot of uncertainty in the actual value.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about, start talking about collectivity. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's shown in this figure here. This is what's called a nuclear level scheme, and it's how we often will represent the different energy eigenstates in the nucleus. So because the nucleus is Galilean invariant, that means it's rotational invariant. And so the nucleus will always, each state in the nucleus is going to have good angular momentum, which is the quantity associated with rotational invariance. And so we label the states by its angular momentum, which are these numbers here. So this would be a angular momentum, or J equals 1, 3, and so on. And then the other property that's true for all of the different states in the nucleus is they have good parity. And so these are all positive parity states, but you can also have negative parity states as well. And then these are the different energies. And the lines here are the different transitions. And I'll talk a little bit more what these mean, but they're how the nucleus changes energy levels and goes from an excited state, which has higher energies, down to the ground state, which is where it prefers to live. Okay, so when you have what's called collective behavior in a nucleus, you sort of start to deviate from our sort of naive picture, simple picture of the nucleus as being a sphere with protons and neutrons in it, and that are equally distributed. When you have collective behavior, which is where the protons and neutrons are starting to sort of interact or move together in a coherent or consistent way, you can end up with the nucleus sort of deforming or changing shape and getting either stretched out or flattened down. And you end up with the nucleus actually tends to look more like these types of shapes. We call this prolate, this is oblate, but it's basically looks like a football or a sort of smashed pancake rather than actually being a sphere. And so once you have these different shapes, the intrinsic state of the nucleus is no longer rotationally invariant. And because it's not rotationally invariant, it wants to recover that rotational invariance. And so you can think of it as starting to rotate in the frame, and the average shape that it makes as it's rotating will again be rotationally invariant. And so we end up with saying we have a collective phenomena, which is nuclear rotations. And I'll come back to this with a little more detail in a bit. And the other type of collective behavior that we often see are giant resonances, which is where the nucleus as a whole is sort of oscillating between different shapes. So you have monopole, which is where the nucleus just sort of expands and contracts. You have dipole, where the protons and neutrons kind of pull away from each other. And you have quadrupole, where the protons and neutrons move in opposite directions relative to each other. And the way that we kind of look for these types of phenomena, the rotations and the resonant behaviors, is we try to look at the different ways that the nuclear states will decay, or the transitions between an excited state and the ground state or some other state in the spectrum. And these are referred to as electromagnetic radiation. So as the nucleus goes from the excited state to its ground state, it has to get rid of some of its energy, so it emits a photon. And so when we describe this system, we're not just thinking of it in terms of just two energy eigenstates or two wave functions. You have your excited wave function plus your electromagnetic field in its ground state, and then that goes to the ground state plus an electromagnetic field that's sort of, you can think of as being excited by or having created a photon. And that's the actual system that we're trying to describe or measure. So the way we try to probe this type of stuff is, for example, you can have a reaction where you bring a certain number of protons and neutrons together, smash them together, and when they form the nucleus that's made up of all the composite system, typically the state that forms isn't going to be the ground state because it has additional energy, because the ground state is more tightly bound, so it's at a lower energy than just the sum of the constituent particles. And so it'll form an excited state and then decay, and this is how we sort of look for or probe the structure. But then we want to be able to describe theoretically the transition, or how you go from this excited state to the ground state. And the way we do this is by doing a multipole expansion of the electromagnetic field associated with the photon. And you end up with sort of two different types of terms in this multipole expansion. The electric term, which is more closely tied to, or you can think of describing the orbital motion of the moving charges or the moving protons. And then there's the magnetic term, which has to do with the spin of the protons and neutrons, and how that interacts with sort of that orbital motion of the particles. For the purposes of collective behavior, we most often are interested in sort of the electric part, particularly since you think of like with the rotational dynamics, that's sort of orbital motion, and so that's what we care more about. So when we do this multipole expansion, and we get an expression for our field in terms of these different operators, and we can look at the different terms and say, compute the likelihood of the excited state decaying to the ground state or some other state via that particular type of transition. So that you have the electric transitions, and then there's this lambda will vary from 0 up to whatever number, although typically you only measure up to about lambda equals 3. And after that, it's the contributions or the transition probabilities of decaying by that mode is so small we can't measure them. And that's what's actually labeling these different lines here, these different transitions, is the different modes you have here. This is a magnetic transition with lambda equals 1. This is electric transition with lambda equals 2, and so on. And so if I were to compute all of the different transition probabilities of the likelihood of it decaying by these different types of modes, added them up and took the inverse of that sum, that will actually give you the half-life of the state. But when we talk about transition probabilities, typically in nuclear physics, we actually describe or quote it in terms of a slightly different property or quantity rather than the transition probability. The transition probabilities go like the energy of the photon raised to some power, where that power depends on the mode or that it's transitioning by, times this quantity, which is called the reduced transition probability. And this is just the matrix element squared of my operator that I obtained by doing this multipole expansion. And so this is the quantity that we can actually calculate in our different theoretical frameworks. And this is the property that people look at in general. So one way to calculate these transitions is to make some additional simplifying assumptions. And one of the most common one is to estimate it by saying each of the different single particles are sort of independent, and so you can calculate the transition probability for each particle separately and just sort of combine them to get your transition probability. And this is what people refer to as single particle estimates. It's also sometimes referred to as Weisskopf estimates because Weisskopf was the one who came up with the idea. But if you have collectivity, so example, if you have all of those protons and neutrons are rotating coherently together, and it's that coherent rotation that gives you the excitation energy, then these single particle estimates aren't that good. They're actually going to be way too small. And so the way we look for collective behavior or collectivity in the states is we look for cases where you have much larger transition probabilities than you would have expected based on if you just assumed all the single particles were moving independently. So this is a little bit more on the formalism of what a nuclear rotation is. So you have that sort of intrinsic state, which is deformed, and we characterize that intrinsic state by a single quantum number, it's K, where K is actually the projection of the angular momentum of the system once it starts to rotate, projected onto the symmetry axis of your deformed shape. And so you have this intrinsic state that then rotates in the lab frame, and as it's rotating, that rotation adds additional energy. And you can have different amounts of rotation. So you end up with states with different energies. And the set of states that you can generate just by, you can think of as the nucleus rotating faster and faster and faster. We call these rotational bands. And it's a set of states that have sort of characteristic energies. Because in this very simplified picture where you have a sort of semi-classical rotation, the energies of the states that are projected out as it's rotating look like some sort of constant energy that's the same for all of the states with the same intrinsic state. And then the additional energy you get is just coming from the angular momentum squared operator. So it goes like J times J plus 1. So if I were to take all of the different energies that I calculated, and these are excitation energies, I've subtracted off the binding energy of the ground state from each of the different energies that I obtained by diagonalizing my Hamiltonian. And I've plotted them versus J, but actually it's plotted versus J times J plus 1, although I labeled it by J. And reason I do that is if I have states that belong to the same rotational band, they all the states have this sort of characteristic energy, they're going to fall on a straight line. And these different boxes are all of the different energy states that I've calculated. And then just for comparison, the green lines are known experimental values for the excitation energies. And so you see these three states all fall very much on a straight line, which is our first hint that this is a rotational band. But the other hint, as I was talking about before, the main thing that we look for are these enhanced transition probabilities. And these gray lines are indicating the transitions between these different states, where the thickness of the line and the shading, so darker lines, correspond to the strength of the transition. So these very thin lines, these would be sort of what you'd expect to naively get if you just take sort of the single particle estimates. But these little bit darker lines and these really dark lines, these are where you have what we call enhanced transitions, where the transition is much larger than those single particle estimates. And so between these three states, you do in fact see an enhancement of the transition strength between them. And so we'd say this looks like a rotational band. Now there's another set of states that have these sort of strong or darker lines between them, also fall more or less on a straight line. And so this would be another rotational band. And so we can identify sort of three different rotational bands from the calculated energies for beryllium-10. And there's another type of rotation that you can have where in addition to the nucleus rotating, we're thinking of the deformed nucleus as rotating, when you have sort of weakly bound system where some of the particles are less tightly bound, especially if you have just a single additional particle, that sort of, you can think of that additional particle as it's also rotating, but it's rotating at a different rate than the rest of the particles. And so that creates what we call the Coriolis effect. And what happens is that when you have this sort of Coriolis term, or this additional particle moving at a different rate, is you get a bit of a change in the energies, and it actually creates staggering in the energies. So instead of my energies having just this characteristic energy here, there's an additional term where it depends on whether or not what the angular momentum of the state is, whether or not the Coriolis effect adds additional energy or takes away energy. And so you get this staggering of energies around what would have been the energies you've got without that additional particle. So if we compare the spectrum or the energies from beryllium, as you go from beryllium-10 to beryllium-11, where I've added that additional particle in, the energies that we get out, in fact, do look a lot like you have some sort of staggering around the beryllium-10 rotational energies. And so that's the other type of rotation that we will often see. So the neat thing about these results is we have a very simple theory for describing nuclear rotation, or this sort of collective phenomena. And that's what allows us to get these very simple expressions for the energies. But this is a highly phenomenological model. It's essentially a toy model. And there's no reason to expect that this should be what the nucleus does, except it does. We see this all over the place. And these results, or these sort of rotational dynamics, are coming out of our calculations, where I've made no assumptions about any type of rotational behavior, no assumptions about it being collective or not. All we put into this was that sort of interaction that we derived from the chiral effective theory, from the underlying quantum chromodynamics. And so it's neat. So then we can connect this sort of type of collective behavior, these sort of that give rise to these types of patterns, directly to the underlying interactions. And we can understand what terms in the expansion of the potential are actually relevant for this type of physics. And that's kind of right now a huge area of interest in ab initio nuclear physics. And there's been a lot of attention on trying to make that connection, understand that connection recently. And then the other thing that can happen in these nuclei is you can have effects where, because this Coriolis staggering is so large, you can have cases where this is what I would have expected from sort of a shell model picture, where I'd filled up the particles, the lowest energies were sort of at lowest filled shells. But this describes states where I take one particle and I've excited it by one quanta. And when you do that, you change the parity of the state. And normally those states with different parity will be higher in energy because you've had to excite a particle. But here in beryllium-10, because the state is so collective and it has such a large deformation, plus you have this additional particle that then is moving around the deformed state in that sort of Coriolis effect, that those two things together are actually enough to drive that sort of state with different parity down further in energy than what we'd expect from the shell model picture. And we get what's called parity inversion because the ground state doesn't actually have the parity that we had sort of expected if we had taken that simple shell model picture. And so there's these types of phenomena as well that are coming out naturally from these calculations, which you wouldn't have naively gotten from things like the shell model. Okay, and so just to summarize, so our goal is to predict properties of nuclear structure and reactions starting from the interactions between protons and neutrons, which make up the nucleus. This goal is complicated by the fact that we don't actually know what the nuclear force looks like. We can sort of probe it experimentally, but we don't have any sort of inverse square law that tells us how it behaves. However, we can use effective theories and lots of series expansions to still obtain reasonable approximations for nuclear properties as long as we're try to be careful about saying what the errors are associated with the values that we get. And then we use these sort of first principle or ab initio predictions to try to study things, for example, like the emergence of collective behavior, like nuclear rotations or those giant monopole resonances. And so that's sort of the background of the type of stuff that I work on. Thank you.
Okay, super. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. We had some questions during the talk, but are there further questions now? Yeah, please go ahead.
So I've got a question regarding these additional Coriolis nucleons or additional Coriolis effects that you've added. So does the oblateness or does the shape of the nucleus actually change how the rotational that extra Coriolis particle rotates around? Does it does it rotate around the one axis or another? Does it have a preferred axis? And does that even matter?
Yeah, so the picture of the extra neutron or proton orbiting around the nucleus is a little bit of an oversimplification, in all honesty. It's very much a sort of semi-classical picture. So in reality, what's happening is it's probably orbiting in sort of all different directions. It may have sort of a preferred axis as it goes around. A lot of times, because you get lower energies when you have larger deformation, it will often prefer to go around sort of the longer axis. But it's a quantum particle, and it doesn't just move in a sort of a circle. It sort of pops in and out and around, and it's sort of an average that sort of creates that sort of rotational looking picture. So the answer is sort of yes and no.
Cool. Very good. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, I was also curious about how I think it was the oblateness and the prolateness of the nucleon sort of affects the energies that you would get out of this model. Because in the sort of way that you described it, when it becomes more prolate like this, we lose part of the rotational symmetry. So this thing sort of gains some kind of angular momentum like properties. But surely that should depend on how prolate the nucleon that we're looking at is. Is there some kind of thing that captures that?
Yeah, so when you have, I guess there's two things. When you have something that's much more like larger deformation, so more prolate or more oblate, the intrinsic state has a larger moment of inertia. Which means this parameter here, this A, it's actually inversely proportional to the moment of inertia. And so this particular band, because the slope of the line is flatter than this slope, that means that this has a larger moment of inertia, which means it has a larger deformation or it's more prolate. And so the prolateness or the oblateness of the intrinsic state impacts what the energies are and how separated the energies are in the spectrum. And then it also will dictate to some extent how much additional angular momentum you can add into the system by when the nucleus tries to rotate to recover its rotational invariance. So if it's the more deformed it is, generally speaking, the more levels that you can have or generate in the nucleus as it kind of speeds up, because there's a larger moment of inertia, and so it can actually get going faster and faster. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I also maybe have a sort of more silly question. So the J that's characterizing the rotations here, is that in any way related to the sort of regular angular momentum that we think of when we think about like shell model or just do regular quantum mechanics on hydrogen, for example? Is there a connection I can think of there besides just characterizing rotation?
Yeah, so the J here, this J value, it's the J of the state.
Yeah,
So it's this angular momentum value.
okay, yeah,
Yeah, so the state itself, even though we think of it as some sort of intrinsic deformed shape that's rotating, the state itself is the composite. It's the intrinsic state plus the rotation. So the angular momentum of that state is the angular momentum that we're describing in this sort of energy formula.
okay. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So I guess that would then, it would be identical, right? In the sense that
Yeah,
it has the same quanta of intrinsic angular momentum as a hydrogen atom, right?
yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so so if I was describing hydrogen spherical, but
Yeah,
if it wasn't,
Well, I guess
or
you're
you
thinking
could,
atomic hydrogen, right?
atomic, yeah,
Yeah.
oh yeah, yeah, so it's the same, basically the same property.
okay.
Very good.
I just had one more question regarding this plot. I thought I understood it, and I think you did introduce it, but I'm just want to re-clarify. There's because there's a lot going on. You said there's also actual data measurements of the thing versus the theoretical prediction. Which one's the data? Which one's the theory again?
So the experimental data is the green lines. In this plot, everything else is calculated.
Okay, so then that does lead me to my next question. Is there seems to be a two that do not agree very well. Those two green lines roughly around 5 and just above 5 that don't agree well with any of your theoretical predictions. It almost looks like there's something missing in that region. Is there anything that that should be noted about those, or is it just there's a difference and it is covered within uncertainties or isn't?
Yeah, so it actually turns out that if I had gone to, this is a snapshot at a particular value of n max. And actually, if we go up to n max 12, all three of these states actually drop down further in energy, and they actually come much closer to these green lines. So this discrepancy here between these two is actually just the error coming from the convergence. So if I look at I'd actually put an error bar here that this would actually fall within the error associated with these calculated states.
Okay, thank you very much.
Cool. Good question. Yeah. Did you have a question, Jack? So, chair's prerogative. There's some notion from the heavy ion community that doing these light ion runs at the LHC will provide insight into nuclear structure, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
I am aware of the experiments and the plans to try to probe nuclear shape using those experiments, but I don't actually know how much about what the actual experiments are, and how they're planning to extract the properties.
Okay, diplomatic response. And then I have this sort of vague, sort of lore understanding of the small nuclei as essentially solved once you can, once you get below a certain number of nucleons. And is it this work that you're doing that perhaps this lore that I have a sense of that the nucleus for small number of nucleons is essentially a solved problem?
So that, I guess, would depend on what you call small number of nucleons. So if you're talking about, say, three or four particles, mostly that's true.
Yeah.
Beyond that, there are still quite a few unknowns. So particularly in these sort of extreme limits out here, we often see what they call them halo nuclei, where you have a very loosely bound additional particle. And that can very significantly change sort of the properties of the states. And a lot of the theoretical frameworks and models still struggle to accurately predict those properties. And that actually has some pretty important consequences on things like reaction rates.
Okay.
And so I would actually argue that it's perhaps not as solved as you might think.
All right, good. So there's still a lot of work for people to do.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a lot we still don't know.
Very good. Okay, any last questions? Let's thank our speaker once more. So thank you so much for being up early for us and giving this great introduction. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Cheers. See you in a week.